Hi, my name is Rowan Hildebrand-Chupp. I'm a PhD student in sociology and science studies at UC San Diego. So as some background, I started thinking about these issues when I started my PhD 4 years ago. And I really wanted to figure out what kinds of evidence would enable me to make claims about the influence of values on expert decisions. I had a particular case, and I was familiar with the philosophical literature on values in science and medicine. So I was really interested in kind of looking at these things and how they play out in specific cases. So I read extensively on values across a range of subfields, and I ended up analyzing the methods that were used to study particular cases in some classic texts in philosophy of science and STS. And I really tried to critically appraise their methodological assumptions to look at how are they making claims about this and what kinds of evidence are they using as a basis to make those claims. But ultimately, after going through all that work, I have come to think that the key methodological issues are primarily moral and political. And I'll explain what I mean in a moment. But that's kind of the broad trajectory that I've gone through. And so that's the result of all of that thinking is this talk. So I kind of start with this basic question: how should scholars descriptively study the role of values in science? And in particular, I'm really interested in using this question: what is descriptive knowledge about values in science for, to guide choosing what we study? My main argument in this talk is that scholars who descriptively study values in science should shift methodological approaches. Rather than studying expert values as primary causes of expert action, we should study expert valuations as outcomes that are influenced by a range of factors. In other words, the question that I originally sought out to try to understand, that is, how to make claims about expert values as causes of expert actions, I came to see that that question itself wasn't really as important as I thought. So I think in the philosophical literature on values in science, in the last 20 years, there's really been a ton of progress and really great work that's been done arguing for the moral and ethical case for values in science, i.e., making the case that scientists and other kinds of experts have a moral responsibility to take values into account when they're deciding what to do. And I think Matt Brown has done really great and persuasive work to sort of synthesize some of these arguments and kind of condense them to a broader umbrella that he calls the contingency argument. So Brown argues that expert practice has contingent moments, that is, moments where there are reasonable alternative possible options about what to do. And that in a lot of cases, selecting one of these options has implications and consequences for things that we care about, such as values. And as a result, experts should make value judgments. That is, they have a moral responsibility to think about values and consider them when they're acting in these contingent moments. So a very simple example is choosing what to study, right? Choosing to study one topic over another or using one method over another can have certain consequences later on down the line that can be relevant to different kinds of values. And so the contingency argument suggests that researchers should really consider those value relevant effects when they're deciding what to study. So the descriptive tasks of the contingency argument are actually quite clear and circumscribed, right? We've got two main aspects. There's the causal relationship between expert actions and effects that are relevant to a certain value or value relevant effects. And you have to show that there's some alternative possible action or practice, right? And the logic of this is pretty clear, right? Experts are doing something that's causing certain kind of effects related to a certain value, and they could do something else that would have a different set of effects, right? So an example from my own work, several years ago, I gave a presentation at the Values Conference in Dallas about detransition research and different ways of studying the topic of detransition. And in retrospect, I basically was using the contingency argument to a T, in that I had presented two different possible options for research. And then I argued that those options have different kinds of effects that are relevant to value, that are value relevant, right? And then I ultimately argued that one of them was probably more worth doing than the other. And I sort of had this qualification where I acknowledge that not every researcher engaged in each of these types of research necessarily has these goals and value judgments. Rather, this conceptual distinction is a way to describe how the research itself is, in a deeper sense, intertwined with certain goals and values. And I think the contingency argument actually provides a very clear framework for thinking about what that deeper sense is, that it's about the causal effects, right? It doesn't actually have anything to do with the motivations of the experts involved. So I think the descriptive arguments regarding values in science have not fared quite as well, unfortunately. Even when they have strengths, I think that there are certain issues that I'll go into in a moment. I think the classic argument is obviously Helen Longino's incredibly influential book, Science as Social Knowledge, published in 1990, where she made this underdetermination argument, also called the gap argument, which is that social values can act as background assumptions that fill in the logical gap between evidence and a hypothesis or theory. In contrast, Matt Brown has kind of put forth what he calls the practical reason argument, which is basically the descriptive version of the contingency argument. He argues that since settling contingencies in science consists of setting on a course of action, and actions require or imply practical reasons, every choice is value-laden. So here, quite simply, the idea is that because science involves doing things, in situations where you could do different things, choosing between those different options requires values, and therefore science is value-laden. It's a very simple argument. Key difference here from underdetermination, or one of many, is the focus on values as shaping action rather than shaping belief or acceptance of a given theory, right? But ultimately, I find that these kinds of arguments actually have a very clear kind of linear model, right? There's typically when these kinds of arguments get deployed to understand particular cases and the role of values in them, the process goes like this, right? You have some set of broader social or cultural values that become internalized as implicit values or assumptions that in turn causally determine expert actions or beliefs. And it's very straightforward. And you can kind of see here the descriptive tasks involved. You're looking at expert actions, trying to interpret them, understand the values that are sort of hidden behind them, right? And you're also looking at the broader social values and trying to triangulate between those to get at these implicit values. So I have a lot of problems with this argument methodologically, that I spent all this time trying to hash out all the complexities and limitations of this. But I've eventually come to think that there's really only a few key problems that are most important to these two arguments. So I think one is that they both imply in different ways that expert values can be read off of their actions and claims. And that's really problematic because, as social scientists have argued since Weber, it's really important that you need to understand the broader context someone's acting in. You can't just assume that you can tell what someone is trying to do by watching them do it, right? You can't assume that what you think to be the aim of the goal of the action they're engaging in is actually the aim of that action. In the context of the contingency argument, I think the logic of it is actually quite sound. The problem is just that it's very easy to transmute the claim that a given expert action has a particular value relevant effect into a claim about how experts did this because they valued its effect, right? You can't necessarily assume that any given effect was intended or sought after in the people that brought about the actions that led to it. It's a very simple way to put it, right? With the descriptive approach, the sort of standard linear model, once again, it does ultimately rely on looking at expert actions or beliefs and then trying to sort of dig under them to find the implicit value. And that can be really problematic unless you have a really rich understanding of the context they're operating within. Ultimately, however, I think these two approaches are either too individualistic on one hand or too generically social on the other. So I think the contingency argument is very individualistic, understandably so, because it's ultimately a moral argument about the moral responsibility of individual scientists and experts, right? But it's also very clear that broader social factors, processes, institutions, organizations, norms, et cetera, also influence what experts do, right? And so only thinking about what was possible for a given individual actually really downplays the range of ways that social and historical factors shape the possible alternatives that are available to a given expert or scientist. I think with the standard linear model, ironically, it's almost too generically social, right? The role of social or cultural values is very vague. It comes from the sort of amorphous mists of culture as sort of somehow determining the values of everyone in a given society or group, right? The problem being that it's very hard to intervene at the level of broader social or cultural values, right? Like changing what everyone, the extent to which everyone values something is very difficult in a sort of obvious way, which makes this particularly tricky in terms of thinking about how you would make change. Obviously, there are some ways. For Helen Longino, part of what made this argument so important was showing why diversifying epistemic communities was crucial, right? That if you get people from different social backgrounds, you can get people with different kinds of implicit values or assumptions. I think that is useful, and it certainly is an important strategy, but as we found in the last 30 years, it's also much harder than we thought to diversify epistemic communities. Moreover, I think it's just one type of intervention, right? It's just one way of changing experts' valuations and the way that they're acting to take value relevant consequences into account. So the most important problem with these two is really that they just don't provide many avenues for interventions designed to encourage experts to take value relevant consequences into account, right? I think with the contingency argument and its descriptive version and the practical reason argument, it really lends itself to thinking about training individuals to look for contingent moments, to think reflexively about the consequences of what they're doing. But of course, the problem is, no matter how much you train someone, if they go into a situation where their practices are structured in a way that prevents them from actually taking those consequences into account, the training won't matter for anything, right? So I mean, a very simple example is just imagine an engineer who gets very rich training and thinking about values and design and the ethics of engineering, and then they go to work in an industry that's very poorly regulated. And in that industry, anyone who brings up a particular set of value relevant consequences gets fired. In that situation, trying to train people out of a particular course of action through values training is just not going to be very effective. And it's really clear that regulation is going to be a much more helpful goal. So similarly, I think that, as I just mentioned, there are certain interventions that are implied by the standard linear model, but it still is very constrained. I mean, you can just look at these models. There's just not many factors involved, right? So I think where we need to go is we need to think about what kinds of value relevant effects is descriptive research into values in science trying to enable. In other words, we need to take the contingency argument and apply it to ourselves, right? If we are experts who study how values shape experts or the role of values and expertise, then what kinds of value relevant effects are we trying to enable? And I think the obvious one is we're trying to change societies to enable experts to take the value relevant consequences of their actions into account. That is, we're trying to influence expert valuation. At the end of the day, that's the goal of a lot of literature on values in science. But if the goal is changing expert valuations, then it's pretty clear that what we need to study is the factors that shape expert valuations that get enacted. So by that, I mean in particular technologies or bodies of research or standards or clinical protocols, any kind of expert object you could imagine, you can think about that object as enacting a particular kind of expert valuation. And understanding the factors that shape those gives you a sense for what you can change. So this is really influential. This is really important because it shifts the empirical question, right? From where I started, right, 4 years ago, how do experts' values influence their beliefs and actions? That's values as causes, to thinking about what factors shape expert valuations. So valuations as outcomes. And when you think of valuations as outcomes that get enacted in particular kinds of objects or decisions, then you really open up a range of processes, factors, just like a range of explanatory options, right? Which in turn really opened up a wide range of areas for intervention and change. So there's a group of STS scholars who have really argued in favor of this approach, and they've called it valuography. And I share a lot of their sentiments, and I share about probably 80% of the connotations of that term that it has for them. I think that the key point here is just that there is a very big difference between studying values as causes and values as outcomes. So we can look at this diagram here. This diagram shows how when you switch to a valuographic approach, you open up a much wider range of things that you can intervene on. So in this context, we have some of the existing pieces from the previous diagrams, right? We have the relationship between a specific expert valuation and value relevant effects. But now we've opened up, we're looking at regulatory regimes, we're looking at formal epistemic standards, research funding, we're looking at experts' habits of valuation. That's what you could call implicit values, right? So experts' habits of valuation in this model don't derive solely from some background set of values, right? They derive from their experiences and practices in the social environments they're operating within. Similarly, I think this model gives you a framework for understanding social movement activity and how social movements make a difference, right? That they can force experts to take into account certain kinds of values and goals based on activists' own embodied knowledge and lived experience of the value relevant effects of expert practices. So in this model, by opening up all these things, you can imagine trying to change any of these in order to change expert valuation. And this is much more doable than just trying to change some default background mode, right? So there's a lot of different examples of this I'm not going to go into in detail. Here are just a few from this edited volume. I definitely suggest checking it out. But in each of these, the important thing is that you're looking at a particular enacted valuation, so how organs are allocated in practice or how quality is defined in a healthcare system, and you're looking at the various kinds of factors that are influencing it. So ultimately, I think this approach really has a number of advantages. I think it avoids some of the methodological pitfalls of existing work by kind of making it harder for you to assume that you can tell the ends of a given action just by kind of looking at it. And I think more importantly, it really practices what we preach in the sense that it provides a descriptive research agenda that enables attending to stakeholders' value relevant questions. After all, if we want experts to take the value relevant consequences of what they're doing into account, then we should do the same for us. And so in that sense, this talk is really about taking the advances and sort of successes of philosophers thinking through the moral and ethical arguments in favor of values in science and using those to reshape the descriptive research agenda for the values in science literature. Thank you, and I appreciate your time.